1883. By the end of that year, the granite wasteland north of Lake Superior had sprouted a new growth, the survey stakes of the railroad builders. From the very beginning, this 700-mile stretch of unyielding rock and seemingly bottomless muskeg had threatened John A. Macdonald's national dream. Now it was beginning to break the CPR. The Canadian Pacific Railway Company had now been at work for 3 years, and it had completed the middle section of the railway running west from Thunder Bay, through Winnipeg, across the prairies to the foot of the Rockies. But then it faced 3 separate walls of towering mountains between that section of the line and the Onderdonk section, which was moving east from the Pacific coast. And to reach settled Ontario from Thunder Bay meant crossing the formidable barrier of the Laurentian Shield. And at this point, with the most difficult and expensive construction facing it, the company was almost out of money. Hidden extras kept cropping up in the expenditures. You see, the government did not pay the subsidy to the railway company until each section of the line was complete, and so that meant working all winter in 50 below weather and often in 5 feet of snow. And it meant a constant struggle to keep costs down and to try to find some extra money somewhere. It meant that they couldn't let up. If they did, it looked as if the CPR would falter and fail. The railway's plight had set William Van Horn, its general manager, on a tireless campaign to cut costs. He would have to build the best railway he could for as little money as possible.
What the hell is going on?
But it would take more than Van Horn's thrift to conquer Canadian geography and climate. The CPR faced certain ruin if it couldn't find more millions to pour into construction. That was the unenviable task of the company's president, George Stephen. He kept sending frantic appeals to the government, to John A. Macdonald, old Tamara himself, but nothing, it seemed, would budge him into action. John A. was getting old. As the winter of 1883 closed in across the nation, the CPR tackled the risky business of cutting costs without slackening the pace of construction. It was almost impossible for Van Horn to escape his Montreal office, but wherever he happened to be, he kept up a barrage of penny-pinching decrees.
I would be glad to aid you to a greater extent, but we have not a dollar to spare. Unlike most of our friends in the Northwest, must skin along as best we can. Coal. He wants us to buy more coal. It's perfectly natural. A railway can't run without coal. How much longer?
How much longer, sir? Do you mean the letters?
I'm quite aware of the number of letters, Tate. What I want to know is how much longer we're going to sit here without moving.
The last report I had wasn't too encouraging, sir. The drifting's bad along this stretch. There simply aren't enough men to do the job by hand.
All right. Here, Jimmy. Take this down and have it sent. I want to know why the plow hasn't cleared this track. Now, we better get back to work, Tate. Then we can have a bite to eat.
Mr. Van Horn, about the plough. They asked for 2 more snow ploughs for this stretch, sir, and you had me reply.
I had you reply with absolute correctness that we cannot put what little money we have into extra snow plows. But that shouldn't stop anyone from using the plows they do have in the best way possible, and that means a better way than this. Now then, we'll do 2 more. We'll do 1 more letter. Then we'll have a bite to eat and finish these in jig time. To J.H. McTavish, Land Commissioner, Winnipeg. Dear, etc., etc. Can you not manage a considerable reduction in the expenses of your department until matters improve? You have on your rolls a large number of men whose salaries range very much higher than those we're paying men in similar positions in other departments, viz. Mr. Tate, you know, I believe that even in our present straits, we can afford to overpay Mr. McTavish's man for just a few more minutes. We'll finish these letters a damn sight faster if we're not starving to death.
There was one item in the construction camps that Van Horn could not stint on, and that was food. In a single area, on the Shield, CPR workmen were consuming 12 tons of provisions every day and smoking 4 tons of tobacco every month. But otherwise, the pinch was on.
To George C. Wright, Shepherdville, Manitoba. On your request for the extension of the Manitoba Southwestern Branch, while we fully appreciate the disadvantage under which the people in the district are living, we're utterly helpless in the matter. Railways cannot be built without money, and we're unable to borrow $1 for the purpose. To John Ross, I understand that you have a very large force of men at work quarrying and dressing stone and putting in masonry. This class of work should be confined to such points as will require iron bridges. Permanent trestles of square timbers will stand for 7 or 8 years if necessary. We must not spare $1 for any work that can possibly be avoided or postponed even for a year.
And then, disaster. An early frost had wiped out the western wheat crops, and in the States, the Northern Pacific went bankrupt. Railway stocks plunged, carrying with them the CPR's hopes of raising money by the sale of new shares. For the company, these twin calamities could not have come at a worse time. Late one evening in November 1883, George Stephen and Van Horn came here to Earnscliffe to try to persuade John A. to force a government loan down the throat of Parliament. MacDonald turned them down flat. Gentlemen, he said, you might as well ask for the planet Jupiter. There's nothing left to do but take the early morning train back to Montreal. But they had some time to spare, and they spent it in the old Bank of Montreal cottage, where Donald Smith and Jim Hill had first planned the great St. Paul adventure, which launched them all on a fortune. And there they encountered MacDonald's closest cabinet crony, John Henry Pope. Years later, Van Horn recalled exactly what had happened.
So it's him that owns the moon, is it?
That's not the way I heard it.
Go on. Evening, Pope.
The way I heard it, Sir John MacDonald is the moon. I take it you found the Prime Minister unreceptive.
Disaster and ruin. Disaster and ruin.
What happened?
Nothing. He wouldn't be moved.
Nothing was said would move him. Nothing.
And I think it must be said we could not have been more frank.
To the last detail. I accounted for every last penny. Cajoled him. We begged.
We reasoned with them, but
Nothing.
hell, we practically spilled our blood on the floor.
Did you threaten him? Wait for me. I'll be back. Sir John, we must have the government's help, which means that you must find a way of convincing the caucus. They must be brought around to the idea of another loan.
And?
And I think I have the means by which you are going to convince them.
Oh?
Well, I got him out of bed.
And?
And I put it to him the one way you gentlemen had forgot.
You mean you threatened him?
Precisely. Put it this way, I said. The day the Pacific Railway goes bust, the Conservative Party busts the day after. I think I got him with that one.
Christmas 1883, with the CPR demanding the most expensive gift in the land, a $22.5 million loan from Parliament. Something that raised hackles on both sides of the House.
What next?
Put the chain on next, Papa.
Did you make this or did Margaret?
I did.
MacDonald knew he couldn't fight alone, but his strongest cabinet ally, Charles Tupper, was in England. So a cable had been sent across the Atlantic asking for help. It would be a hectic holiday season for the Prime Minister. He barely had time for his daughter, Mary. She'd been handicapped from birth, afflicted both mentally and physically, lacking the coordination to walk or even to lift her own head unassisted.
Now, you're not going to make your own father climb to the top with a star, are you?
Yes, I am. Now. When you put it there, may I see it?
Of course you can. Star.
A wonder, star of light, star of royal beauty bright.
This telegram came, Sir John.
You read it, Mary.
Sailing Thursday. Tupper.
Well, that's good news. For a change.
On February 1st, 1884, the parliamentary struggle began. Charles Tupper proposed a CPR relief bill, and within 2 weeks, the Tories were in revolt. Quebec members demanding railway subsidies of their own. Maritimers unwilling to see money spent on the unknown land to the far west. Finally, the Westerners themselves up in arms over the CPR monopoly and high freight rates. Until the railway, John A. MacDonald had known the people, the places, and the problems of a tight, familiar community, but now all that was changed. Far out along the half-completed line of track, new political leaders he'd never heard of, in communities he'd never visited, were demanding a say in matters he only partially understood. But he issued his usual threat to the caucus. If they did not support him, there'd be an election, and they'd have to face the country on the heels of a government defeat in the House. The Tories fell dutifully, if a little sullenly, into line, and Tupper took over the debate to pilot the relief bill to victory on February 28, 1884. The relief was only temporary. 1884 turned out to be another year of crushing expense for the railway. In June, Van Horn arranged a personal inspection tour of the line across the Shield. He wanted to see the North Superior section that was so quickly using up the government loan. He found the workmen far from content. They'd been lured to this sullen wilderness by wages of $1.75 to $2 an hour. But they weren't paid for the days when bad weather stopped the work, and by the time they'd paid board and their company's store bills, they often ended up with less than $4 for a whole week's work. The bunkhouses on the Shield were crowded with men who were exhausted, bored, irritable, and lonely. In the Thunder Bay Sentinel, one navvy described this kind of a scene.
God!
It was an accident. You don't have to throw it across the room.
Who's this one?
That's her. That's my girl.
You left her for this?
Well, I thought maybe she... There was this other fella. And I told her if she so much as looked at him, I'd teach her a lesson. Well, here I am.
Who's this one?
That's her aunt. The one without the hat? Yeah, that's her aunt.
My God, but women are fine things.
By now, almost 15,000 men and 3,000 horses were at work along this section of the line. Each month, when the pay car went out, it carried more than $1 million in wages. One 90-mile section of the roadbed ate up 10 millions. The total bill for blasting material alone would be $7.5 million. And one single memorable mile of track was laid through solid rock at a staggering cost of $700,000. This is what the crews faced 25 miles east of what would become White River, Ontario. A solid wall of granite, 700 feet thick. To blast their way through that would hold up track laying for the better part of a month. So what they did was they ran the rails right over the top here and let the trains and the men and the material come through. And by the time this cut was finished, the track had moved another 30 miles. There was tremendous irony on the Shield in 1884, because in the midst of the CPR's financial crisis in this most difficult terrain, a railway blacksmith named Tom Flanagan picked up a piece of rock near Sudbury and thought he'd found gold. He hadn't. He was standing on a copper mine, and more than that, on the biggest nickel deposit in the world. He didn't get rich from that, but others did, and that touched off the great Ontario mining boom, and it made millionaires out of one or two sharp-eyed CPR employees. But that wasn't going to help the railway, not now, because in order to get the government loan, the CPR had to promise that they would finish the line in 5 years instead of 10, and that meant that the deadline was only about 18 months away. The crisis sent George Stephen on a frantic race from capital to capital, continent to continent, trying to keep the CPR afloat. Government subsidy payments were maddeningly slow, but if the company couldn't keep up with its debts and payrolls, then the subsidies would stop altogether, and that would be the end of the CPR.
I think you're being very unfair, Prime Minister. You could at least listen to what I have to say.
I don't need to hear what you have to say. I don't want to. However, it's your breath. You waste it if you want to.
All I'm asking is that you try to convince the government to delay the repayment dates on our loan, not the loan itself. Get the pressure off.
The pressure will never be alleviated, Stephen. Surely you must know that by now. Well, it will be alleviated once, the day they drive the last spike, but not before that. Till then, we must go on as we are. Still, I'll have a word with Tupper. I'll see what I can do. Don't get your hopes up. I'm getting too old, Stephen, to put the death grip on these fellas anymore.
In late July, Van Horn took a long-delayed journey to the west to check on mountain construction and to inspect the site for the CPR's Pacific terminus. The terminus was to be on Burrard Inlet at Port Moody, where giant Douglas firs towered above the tidal flats. The Port Moody Gazette was ecstatic about the little town's future.
Port Moody has no rival. There is no place upon the whole coast of British Columbia that can enter into competition with it.
Van Horn arrived, and he was anything but ecstatic.
There's not sufficient room. 400 acres of level ground will be required for railway purposes alone, and it would cost $2 to $4 million to reclaim this amount of land from the tide flats at Port Moody.
However, out at the mouth of Burrard Inlet, there was a dismal collection of buildings called Coal Harbor, near what was known locally as Gastown after an early saloon keeper, Gassy Jack Dayton. And here there was plenty of space for a terminus with room left over for the budding metropolis that Van Horn himself would name Vancouver. The citizens and the press of Port Moody were all a-clamor with futile protests. But by then, Van Horn was off again to have a look at progress up the Fraser. This was the route that had been chosen by government engineers, and the line was being built by Andrew Onderdonk on government contracts. Years later, Van Horn would tell an American Senate committee that if it had been up to the CPR, the BC section would never have been constructed here through what he called one of the worst places in the world.
impossible grades. Boulders, debris, a continuous fall of rock. The damn slopes are too steep. It was my information that these curves were not to exceed 4 degrees. Hell, that seems more like 10 to me. Too many bloody trestles. And the worst I've ever seen.
My God.
Beyond any question, the worst piece of railroad building in the whole world.
By August of 1884, the CPR was still faced with a great expensive chunk of mountain construction, some of the worst of it right here in the Selkirks. Van Horn had left his Pacific cruise at the end of track, not far from Kamloops, and he'd come this way on foot through Eagle Pass along with Major Rogers, and it was a miserable trip. They had frozen mud, they had slush from an unexpected snowfall, and worst of all, they had the Major's erratic provisioning. They went without food for 2 days, and Van Horn claimed at the end of it he could smell ham 40 miles away. But if things went according to plan, that was the last time that anybody would have to walk through these mountains, because the CPR would be completed in less than 18 months. The big question was, where would they find the money to finish the job? When Van Horn reached the Rockies, he could see how slowly the mountains were giving way to the railroad. In that summer of 1884, the CPR needed 12,000 men in the mountains. And since June, they'd been pouring in from all over, one of the armies of nameless navvies whose backbreaking labor would help bring the national dream to reality. The work was often as dangerous as it was difficult. Near one of the several tunnels along the Kicking Horse River, the cut in the hill was so deep that men worked in 3 tiers. Those at the top toiled in comparative safety, but for the 2 groups below, there was the constant hazard of falling rock. The worst section in the Rockies was certainly the descent from the summit of the Kicking Horse Pass. On their queasy way down what came to be called the Big Hill, the heavily loaded trains had to navigate flimsy-looking trusses and trestles as the line switched back and forth across the river 8 times. And this was it, the horror of the Big Hill. Here, the Kicking Horse River drops 1,100 feet in 3.5 miles on its plunge to the Columbia. Van Horn was going to try to risk something that no other railroad had ever attempted, a grade of 4.4%. Now, that may not seem very much to you, but it meant that in 1 mile, the track would have to drop the height of a 30-story building. That was twice what the contract allowed, and it was 4 times steeper than the ideal maximum. For the next 25 years, this would mean 8 miles of nightmare travel. Getting up took 4 locomotives more than an hour, and that meant there'd be 4 times the chance of engine failure. The trip down was not to be believed. The first locomotive to try it flew off the rails, plunged into the river, and killed 3 men. And even with shorter trains and safety switches and better brakes and a tougher speed limit, the damage would be incalculable in terms of broken machinery and human lives. Ultimately, it would take 10,000 men working 2 years to build the famous spiral tunnels to get around all this. But there wasn't a man on the main line who didn't believe it was very worthwhile. All summer, the mountains rang with the furious noise of construction and with the exclamations of those tourists who crowded in, hard on the heels of the workers, to gaze on the wonders of the Rockies. But already some of the scenery was fast disappearing. The mountains that year were ablaze with forest fires started by construction workers, some accidentally, some deliberately. On his way east, it's possible that Van Horn took time to visit the Badlands to renew his old interest in fossils. He'd always been an ardent amateur geologist and fossil hunter. In fact, 9 new species bore his name. Old railwaymen working in the quarries used to find him a sure market for fossils. The slightest hint of a discovery would send him out with his geologist's hammer and his sample box. There was one time in Alton, Illinois, when he'd been tantalized for weeks by the spectacle of a fine trilobite embedded in a slab sidewalk, and finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. And on an irresistible impulse, he smashed the pavement with his hammer, and he bore the trophy away. Whatever Van Horn did, he did to the full. And now he was building the Pacific Railway. As he traveled across the plains, he could see the byproducts of his work, the string of new places on the map, slowly changing from tent and shack towns to permanent prairie settlements, and all spawned by the CPR. What Van Horn may not have noticed were the signs of growing unrest among the native peoples. Past winter had been simply dreadful. Early frosts killing crops, bringing on food shortages and near starvation. The Indians felt that Ottawa was betraying them. Their meager food rations were being cut back as part of a general government retrenchment. And on some reserves, people were dying by the score, and bitter resentments were growing. And then there were the Métis, denied in the Saskatchewan country what Louis Riel had won for them 15 years earlier in Manitoba, a share in the Aboriginal title to the land. Some were receiving free land, but too often it was ending up in the hands of white speculators, and a dangerous discontent was spreading. For more than a decade, Riel had been in exile in Montana, but now his people wanted their leader back. In June, nobody had paid any attention to a group of Métis horsemen slipping quietly across the American border, but on their return, there had been one extra rider, Louis Riel. Now, 2 months later, Van Horn headed back to Montreal. He traveled past the farms that were springing up along the line, through his old headquarters, Winnipeg, where almost a quarter of the 25,000 inhabitants were directly dependent upon the railway. Throughout the sparsely settled land, Westerners everywhere were slowly coming to a boil over the CPR monopoly and Ottawa's deaf ears. By that fall, George Stephen in Montreal was desperate. Almost all of the spring loan had been gobbled up by construction, and now the company's credit at home and abroad was gone. He wrote to MacDonald with these words: "I feel like a man walking on the edge of a precipice. The uncertainty is too much for me with all the other difficulties. The ordeal I'm going through is not easy to stand." Stephen and his cousin, Donald Smith, were dipping into their private fortunes to keep the CPR going, and they were close to the bottom of the barrel. In Ottawa, MacDonald refused to listen to the CPR's repeated distress signals. If only the railway could be completed, the profits would roll in, but by October, George Stephen realized there simply wasn't enough money to do the job. Stephen's scramble for millions took him to Europe 3 times in 1884. But he was finally able to raise a $250,000 loan from a Scottish financial house by pledging more of his stock and of his cousin's, Donald Smith. And that piece of Highland good cheer caused him to send what is surely the most memorable cablegram in Canadian history, and certainly one of the shortest. Just one brief cryptic sentence: "Stand fast, Craigellachie." You see, both men came from a part of Scotland where the landscape wasn't all that different from their new home here in Canada. Stephen remembered, and he knew that Smith would remember, the great rock that dominated the valley of Banffshire, which was their home. It was called Craigellachie, and in the brave old days, this was the rallying point for the Clan Grant. In fact, its name was the Clan's war cry. And so Donald Smith in Montreal, receiving that cablegram, must have heard the sound of warring claymores and the wild skirl of the pipes as he read that sentence: "Stand fast, Craigellachie." On January 12, 1885, Montreal was the scene of a gigantic celebration. Sir John A. Macdonald had just achieved his 70th birthday and his 40th year of public life.
You've pulled me so tight I can't move.
Well, you're a national monument now, my dear. And national monuments don't move.
Outside, the streets were thronged with well-wishers. A torchlight parade was to escort John A. and Agnes to the great drill hall in Place d'Armes, where the Prime Minister would address a gathering of hundreds.
There was an old man, a monk, living out his days in an ancient monastery somewhere in Europe. And it was his job, a very special, self-appointed job, to care for the portraits of the departed members of his order. And one day he said to some visitors he was showing the portraits to, "Oh, I feel sometimes as if after all, they are the realities and we are the shadows." Thank you.
That was the one bright moment in those dark months. In the East, MacDonald faced a cabinet revolt over the latest railway money troubles, and George Stephen fought off personal and corporate ruin. On the Shield, Van Horn labored to link up the gaps between isolated stretches of steel. On the prairies, farmers agitated against Eastern monopoly. While Indians and Métis drew closer to open revolt against an unheeding government. And in the mountains, the railway builders faced their last great barrier, the snow-shrouded Selkirks. The Selkirks remained a mystery almost to the moment when steel was driven through them. There was something uncanny about those massive pyramidal peaks scoured by erosion and time. More than 1,000 men were now toiling away in Rogers Pass. The average winter snowfall here reached 50 feet at the summit. In one 6-day period, 8.5 feet of snow fell, and blizzards were known to last 3 weeks. Van Horn had been advised up until the very last moment to avoid the Selkirks, to take the line north along the big bend of the Columbia River and around the mountains. But that would have meant 70 additional miles of railroad, 2 extra hours of passenger time, 4 additional hours for freight. Van Horn is a man who always looked to the future, and he saw the possibilities of competition. And so he decided to take the direct route straight through the Rogers Pass. What he didn't foresee was the 6 miles of snow sheds the CPR would eventually have to build in the Selkirks at a cost of $40 a foot. And even with those snow sheds, there were times in the late winter when it simply wasn't safe to run a train in those mountains. But even if the railroad builders had foreseen the need for those snow sheds, it wouldn't have mattered, because in that winter of 1885, the CPR simply didn't have the money to put them up. George Stephen had just built a magnificent new house in Montreal. It was one of the show places of the city, crammed with the best Victorian bric-a-brac and fine works of art. But without blinking an eye, Stephen mortgaged it all to raise money for the railroad. I guess in the entire history of railway building on the continent, there's never been anything like that. And it's said that Stephen and Donald Smith pledged the remainders of their joint fortunes and personal assets right down to their gold cufflinks. Now the two had nothing left to offer but their Celtic spirit. The only possible hope was another government loan. But old tomorrow was standing firm.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Another communication from Mr. Stevens, sir.
MacDonald was successfully evading the railway's predicament, but out west there were a few prescient observers, mainly mounted policemen and priests, who must have wished that the railway was completed all the way to the prairies. Because if the Métis and Indian situation erupted into violence, then troops would have to be sent to the west. The trouble was there were 4 gaps in the line across the Shield, and these gaps totaled 86 miles. The track that had been laid was largely unballasted, and a lot of it had been laid directly on top of the snow. In between was a frozen waste, onto which icy winds shrieked in from Lake Superior. Now look at this country and ask yourself how anybody, even Van Horn, could get soldiers across here. And yet the only alternative was for the troops to don civilian clothes, pack their guns and equipment separately, and take American railroads to our west. So everybody prayed for the impossible, that the rebellion would never come. Or else they pretended that if they didn't think about it, maybe it would go away. The Prime Minister had received repeated warnings about increased Métis hostility. He'd heard how Riel was whipping them into a frenzy. He'd heard about the Métis leader's own bizarre behavior, sparked by a growing religious fervor and mysticism. But all MacDonald did was to notify the West that the militia might have to be called out. And then, on March 26, 1885, Duck Lake. The Riel Rebellion had begun. MacDonald at last was forced into action, and the CPR was called upon to move troops west and rescue the nation if it could.